from my own point of view, and I'm going to try to give this paper a little bit of a personal spin, I've had two themes that run through these papers with Josh and the prior ones that I did on my own. One theme is about memory, what we're able to remember as an intellectual community, what things we forget, why we forget them, why we often deny having forgotten anything, and sometimes why that makes intellectual recovery of something we've forgotten almost impossible. I'm going to suggest that one reason why we have forgotten certain things in the original meaning of the Constitution is because the act of the Revolution itself cut off our continuing legal education with prior existing legal institutions, particularly the Inns of Court and also the Parliamentary Law Bar in London. I think that in relation to that, and again, this is somewhat from my personal experience for the last several years, there's a related problem in the wider intellectual community of what arguments actually get a hearing and what has to be done to get a hearing. I'm going to make some pointed criticisms of articles that have been written in response to my own, and I could say quite honestly that none of this is at the level of personalities. There's no way to address these arguments without actually talking about them. If I make an argument that for a moment appears to you that I'm suggesting that the author is hypocritical because I'm pointing out he changed his mind, I can assure you that I value nothing higher than a person who's changed his mind. I have from time to time. What I'm trying to illustrate when I show another author has changed his mind is that the problems that I'm seeking to address in this paper are problems that people actually don't believe are there. And they don't even notice sometimes that they've addressed these arguments in their own prior papers. The lesser issue in these papers has to do with the word office. That's actually how I've always thought about these papers, that the actual interpretation of the word office and officer is just an exemplar of the higher level, more abstract issue, which I'm trying to address about memory. To put it in its most succinct form, the word office really has two meanings in the English language. It sometimes simply means position, a position in a hierarchy, a position in a chain of command, and that's the more expansive of the two meanings. There's another meaning that is often used, and we often go from meaning to meaning without actually even noticing we're doing it. It means something under apex authority. Interestingly enough, I've noticed this not just in English and language usage, but you'll also find this in other languages, in Hebrew and Chinese. I had the experience of riding the train to work with a young classics professor from my own university. And at one point he mentioned to me that the Roman emperor, as it was originally set up under Augustus, wasn't in office. And I was extremely puzzled by this. I said, what do you mean it wasn't in office? He said, well, yeah, it wasn't in office until Vespasian. That was several hundred years later. And it took me half an hour to extract out of him what he meant by saying the imperator, the Roman emperor, didn't have an office under the original Roman constitution when that position, I won't say office, was first created. What he said was that originally what was meant by being the emperor was a series of licenses or special grants of authority that the Senate granted one at a time. And once these all became a bundle, it got a new name. But it wasn't considered a position within the hierarchy until many years later, when it became sort of official that this office would be inherited or at least reappointed by the Senate from time to time. I'm also going to, I hope you forgive me, and I hope the purpose of telling this story becomes more clear, but I'm going to try to tell a joke.
Here's a good ending, don't worry.
In order to make a point. There's a street in London called Savile Row, where the tailors are. There's this old Jewish guy, 80, 90, maybe 100 years old. And he goes in to get a suit, not off the rack, but a fitted suit. And he's in front of a mirror, and he's surrounded by tailors who are measuring him. And he starts to cry. And the tailors, who spoke Yiddish, and many of them weren't Jewish, they were Italian, they say to him, "Farbash Venshtu, why are you crying?" And he responds, "We're far from India. We lost India." And that's really what I think about what has happened in our wider intellectual community. We've lost something, and sometimes we don't even know we've lost it. I had this experience, oh man, just 5 minutes, who knew? I had this experience once before, thank you, in 2005, when I wrote a paper on what I thought was the most obscure article in the Constitution. And my experience was that you would find other commentators over the last 200 years who, in order to explain this clause, would simply just repeat the clause, as if everyone knew what it meant. And I think different commentators did think they know what it meant. But no one could write a book saying, I'm giving you a commentary on the Constitution except for 3 clauses. So for the few who didn't know, they would just repeat the clause and hope no one noticed. When I practiced law in Michigan, I had just the opposite experience. In Michigan, I was part of the corporate bar, and there was actually a commentator responding on the DGCL, the Delaware General Corporate Law, who came to a provision and said, no one knows what this provision does. It's just something that never got scrapped in an annual update, and we should probably get rid of it at some point. I don't think we really have that yet in the legal community who do public law and originalism. There's no ability to look at something and to say we really lack clarity or sometimes any idea at all. So anyway, these papers first started as a response to the Amar's paper in 1995. I don't think that comes as any surprise to you who've read the paper with Josh or any of my papers. In 1995, the Amars made the argument that all the varying office language means the same thing, and we shouldn't really look for distinctions, or at least that was the operative simplifying assumption. My papers were largely a response to that, and to tell you the truth, at the beginning, I wasn't trying to make a pitch that my original theory was correct, but to show that other theories might be investigated. The response to that was really quite odd. Steve Calabrese wrote a response, and well, I was actually hopeful at the time that he might be sympathetic, because if you read some of Steve's papers, what you'll find is he uses language in his papers that simply says the president, either making an appointment to a principal office or to an inferior office, has control of all appointments to office. So there was language in his papers that tended to lead to the possibility, at least, that he'd be sympathetic to a theory that all office, as used in the Constitution, or at least officer of or under the United States, would be linked to appointment. Steve didn't go down that road with me. He took a very different path. And as a matter of fact, when I pointed out that in the impeachment clause, the structure of the clause was the president, vice president, and civil officers of the United States are subject to impeachment, and I pointed out that the word other is missing, he said, well, no, the fact that the word other is missing doesn't mean that the president isn't an officer of the United States. The word was skipped because it was redundant. When I pointed out that I wasn't making this argument, that Joseph Story made this argument, that the absence of the word other was significant, which seemed to distinguish president and vice president from office of the United States, his response was, and this is what I think really quite telling, Story was too erudite. Now, that response, that Story is too erudite, is, I think, unheard of in what we do. Could you imagine going into court and being told by the judge, your authority is too erudite? How does one even begin to respond to that? Now, again, I'm not attacking Steve for being breathtakingly honest. What I'm saying is that there is a problem when being erudite is seen as a difficulty with an alternative theory. I had a similar response with Sai Prakash. Sai Prakash's response to the argument that the president and vice president don't hold office of or under the United States was, well, Seth made the argument that these offices have never received commissions. He hasn't produced any proof that these offices never received commissions. And I puzzled over that. How do you find evidence that something didn't happen? All right, the natural response is if Sai wants to make the argument that the president and vice president were commissioned, and there's a history of such commissions, he should go out and find that they were. Things that happen leave records. Things that don't happen frequently don't. It turned out later I was able to find a congressional report that said these positions don't get commissions. But that didn't lead to anyone changing their mind. Do I have another minute?
It's time to stop.
It's time. So I'll stop. I think I've made the points I could make in those 10 minutes. Thank you.